I never saw it coming. That's the truth of it. When you give everything to someone, a career, loyalty, all those long nights working hard so that your family and future are secure, you don't expect to be blindsided by betrayal. But that's exactly where I found myself that night. Let me back up. I'm Mark, a guy who spent years in a competitive industry. My boss, Wheeler, was always someone I respected. Sure, he had his flaws, but he was a brilliant businessman, the kind of man who could navigate any situation. Over the years, I'd learned a lot from him. He'd coach me through my first major project, push me out of my comfort zone, and even vouch for me when no one else did. I trusted him, thought of him as more than just a boss. He was a mentor. Then there's Anna, my wife. We've been together for 12 years, and I always thought we were solid. There were rough patches, sure, but nothing that we couldn't handle. Or so I believed. Lately, though, she'd been different. Distant. She started spending a lot more time on herself, investing in new clothes, new routines, even changing her perfume. I chalked it up to her trying to rediscover herself, maybe get out of a rut. We'd been together a long time, and everyone says you need to give each other space now and then, right? I'd always thought trust was at the foundation of everything. The night of the annual gala was supposed to be a night for us. I'd been looking forward to it, considering it a small break from the grind. I had high hopes for that evening. Wheeler had hosted the event at an upscale venue, going all out with the decorations, music, and catering. It was an opportunity to make connections, build rapport with colleagues, and celebrate the year's successes. I was proud to bring Anna with me, dressed elegantly in a gown I'd surprised her with earlier that week. She looked stunning, and for a brief moment, all my concerns seemed small, insignificant. The evening started smoothly enough. I introduced her to colleagues, laughed with a few friends, and even enjoyed the live band Wheeler had arranged for the night. But something felt off. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but it was there. I caught Anna looking over my shoulder more than once, her eyes drifting across the room, lingering just a bit too long on certain people. I shrugged it off, but the unease wouldn't leave. About an hour into the party, I found myself deep in conversation with a colleague from marketing. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Anna laughing, a sound that normally filled me with warmth. This time, though, there was a note to it that made me pause. She was laughing a bit too freely, leaning a bit too close to Wheeler, who was smiling back at her with a look I'd never noticed before. It was then that I felt the first stirrings of suspicion, a feeling I tried hard to ignore. This was Wheeler, after all, my boss, a man I trusted. And Anna, she was my wife, the woman I'd built a life with. The rational side of me dismissed it as paranoia, a trick of the mind. They were just talking, laughing. What could be wrong with that? But the feeling gnawed at me, a subtle warning I couldn't shake. As the evening wore on, I noticed that Anna seemed to disappear more often than usual. At one point, she excused herself, saying she needed to freshen up. 10 minutes passed, then 15, and finally, after almost half an hour, she returned with a breezy excuse about a long line at the restroom. I accepted it, but I couldn't ignore the sinking feeling that had settled in my chest. She was still being distant. Her responses clipped when I tried to engage her in conversation. At one point, I asked her if everything was all right. She smiled, but it was a strained smile, the kind that doesn't reach the eyes. "I'm fine," she said, brushing me off with a casualness that felt rehearsed. I wanted to believe her, but something in her tone made it hard to ignore that instinct telling me something wasn't right. Near the end of the night, as the band was winding down, Anna disappeared again, this time without a word. I looked around, scanning the room, but she was nowhere to be found. Concerned, I excused myself from my conversation and headed toward the quieter parts of the venue. I didn't know what I was looking for, didn't want to acknowledge the thought lurking at the back of my mind. But as I walked down a dimly lit corridor near the restrooms, I heard faint voices. I stopped listening, my heart pounding in my chest. One of the voices was unmistakably Anna's. The other was Wheeler's. The words were muffled, but the laughter, I recognized it instantly. My stomach turned. I couldn't make out exactly what they were saying, but there was an intimacy, a familiarity that was undeniable. I felt anger boiling up, but I forced myself to stay calm. Charging in there, making a scene, it wasn't my style. If something was going on, I needed to handle it with control and composure. I wasn't about to let them see me broken or enraged. I turned away, the reality sinking in deeper with every step I took back to the main hall. My mind was racing, but one thought cut through all the others. This was just the beginning. Whatever was going on, I was going to uncover every detail. If they thought they could betray me without consequences, they were wrong. As I made my way through the crowd, I forced myself to engage in small talk, smile, and shake hands. Inside, though, a plan was forming, piece by piece. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. I'd spent years building my career, my reputation, and my life. And if Wheeler and Anna wanted to ruin that, I'd make sure they'd feel the cost. The days following the gala were some of the longest I've ever endured. I'd gone back to work, keeping my usual routine, and managed to play the part of the dedicated employee. I forced myself to sit through meetings, to go about my work as though nothing had changed. I interacted with Wheeler as professionally as ever, even though every time I saw him, I felt a surge of anger that I barely managed to keep in check. But I'd learned one thing over the years. Anger gets you nowhere unless you know how to use it. So I kept my emotions in check, waiting for the right moment. Patience wasn't easy, but I wasn't about to rush into something as serious as this without knowing every detail. Back at home, Anna had no idea I suspected anything. She carried on with her routine, acting as though everything was normal. If anything, she seemed more relaxed, as if a weight had been lifted. It was almost insulting, the ease with which she pretended, the way she'd come home each night, acting as though she hadn't just betrayed me. She'd slip into her nightly routines, barely noticing that I'd stopped trying to make conversation, that I was keeping my distance. One evening, after she'd gone to bed, I took her phone from the kitchen counter where she'd left it charging. She was a sound sleeper, and the passcode hadn't changed. She'd always said she didn't like hiding things from me. Ironically, it was this same lack of precaution that would let me uncover everything she thought she could hide. I scrolled through her messages, but there was nothing unusual. Just the typical exchanges with friends and family, a few appointments for her hair and gym sessions. But as I kept scrolling, I noticed something. A number with no names saved, only recent messages, all of which had been carefully deleted. Whoever it was, they were thorough, but not thorough enough. I switched over to her social media accounts, checking messages, posts, and tags. Nothing there, either. For a moment, I wondered if I'd overreacted, if perhaps my suspicions had blown things out of proportion. But then, in her email inbox, buried between confirmations for online shopping and restaurant reservations, I found what I'd been looking for. There it was, an email receipt from a luxury hotel downtown, dated just 2 days before the gala. A reservation for 2, booked under her name. I stared at the screen, feeling a chill wash over me. There was no reason for her to be at a hotel during that time. We both live close to the city center. There was no business meeting or special event I could think of that would require her to stay overnight. And more tellingly, the receipt listed a dinner for 2. She'd booked a night with someone else, no question about it. With a steady hand, I took a screenshot of the receipt, sent it to myself, and deleted the email from her inbox. She'd never know I'd seen it. Now I had proof, or at least the start of it. In the following days, I kept watching, paying close attention to her every move. I noted the time she left for work, the excuses she used to stay out late, even the new habits she'd picked up recently. It was methodical, almost like preparing for a project at work. I tracked her activities, waiting for patterns, for any hint of who this mystery person might be. My suspicions grew when I noticed a recurring pattern. Every Thursday, Anna would claim she had personal development sessions. At first, she'd said they were for a wellness course she'd taken an interest in, something to help her grow. I'd thought nothing of it at the time, but now I saw it differently. Each week, without fail, she'd leave at the same time, returning late, sometimes with that distant, distracted look I'd started noticing more often. It was no coincidence. That next Thursday, I decided to follow her. I told her I'd be working late, making sure she didn't suspect anything. As soon as she left, I slipped out of the house and followed her car at a distance. I didn't know where she was headed, but I had a feeling it wouldn't be to any wellness course. She drove to a part of town I rarely visited, pulling into the parking lot of an upscale hotel. I parked a block away and watched from a distance as she got out of the car, adjusted her coat, and walked inside. My heart was pounding, every nerve on edge, but I kept myself calm. I had to see this through. It wasn't long before Wheeler's familiar car pulled up. He parked near the entrance, and I saw him glance around before heading inside. They were careful, but not careful enough. I didn't follow them in. I already had enough to confirm what I'd suspected, and I wasn't about to cause a scene. This wasn't the time or place for confrontation. No, I had a much bigger plan in mind, something that would hit both of them where it hurt the most. They wanted to play games, and I'd let them think they were winning. I went home that night, forcing myself to act as though nothing was wrong. When Anna returned hours later, she didn't even notice my expression. She greeted me with a half-hearted smile, mentioned some excuse about the session, running late, and headed upstairs. Watching her was like seeing a stranger in my own home. I couldn't believe the audacity, the casualness with which she lied. But I wouldn't be a fool. If they thought I was going to sit back and watch them turn my life upside down, they were sorely mistaken. I had years of experience in this field, knew the ins and outs of my industry, and I knew exactly where I'd start. The next morning, I reached out to a few contacts in my network. There were companies in our sector that would jump at the chance to bring someone with my background on board, and with Wheeler's reputation soon to take a hit, my timing couldn't have been better. I arranged coffee meetings, lunches, discreet conversations where I dropped hints of my dissatisfaction and my interest in a change. It was subtle. I didn't need to say much. The people I spoke to were seasoned enough to read between the lines. I mentioned my desire for new challenges, my curiosity about how other companies manage certain projects, and hinted that my loyalty wasn't being rewarded the way it should be. I saw the gleam in their eyes, the eagerness they tried to hide as they realized I was open to moving on. By the end of the week, I had a solid offer lined up. The terms were good, better than what Wheeler had ever offered, and I'd made sure to negotiate so that I'd have the freedom to bring my own clients over once I transitioned. This wasn't just a career move. It was a calculated step to disrupt Wheeler's world from the inside out. As I drove home that day, I couldn't help but feel a grim satisfaction. I was laying the groundwork, building a new path that wouldn't just serve me. It would ensure that every choice Anna and Wheeler made would have lasting consequences. This was just the beginning. They might not realize it yet, but their lives were about to change in ways they hadn't anticipated. With the new job offer secured, I felt like I had an ace up my sleeve. I hadn't told anyone yet, not even Anna. It was my card to play, a way to control the situation without anyone knowing just how deep my plans were. The move wouldn't just give me a fresh start. It would be the first hit to Wheeler's carefully constructed world. That weekend, Anna suggested we spend some time together, reconnecting. Her word, not mine. Maybe she thought I was still oblivious, that my silence meant I hadn't caught on. It was almost insulting, the way she went through the motions, acting as if everything was fine. She even cooked a nice dinner, put on her best smile, and brought out a bottle of wine she'd been saving. If I hadn't known what I knew, it would have felt like old times. I went along with it, of course. I listened to her talk about her day, shared stories of my own, and kept up the appearance of a man none the wiser. Inside, though, I felt like a stranger in my own life. Every laugh, every smile felt hollow, but I stayed calm. I was saving my energy for what was coming. The following Monday, I arrived at the office early, feeling a new sense of purpose. Wheeler was already there, of course. He prided himself on always being the first one in and the last one out. He gave me a nod and a smile as he walked past my desk, and I returned it, keeping my expression as neutral as possible. It felt strange, almost surreal, knowing what I did and seeing him go about his business as if nothing was wrong. He had no idea what was brewing. Later that day, I took a break and reached out to one of my closest contacts at my new prospective firm. We spoke in quiet tones, going over the specifics of my transition. I made it clear that my knowledge of our current firm's projects and client relationships could be a significant asset. If Wheeler thought he could replace me easily, he was in for a surprise. I knew the ins and outs of every major project we were working on, and I planned to use that knowledge to my advantage. In the days that followed, I continued to lay the groundwork. I took careful notes on my clients, making sure I had all the relevant details for each account. By the time I walked away from this job, I'd have a comprehensive list of contacts and information that would make my transition seamless and, ultimately, damaging to Wheeler's business. He'd feel every bit of it. My meetings with Anna, meanwhile, grew fewer and shorter. I noticed she stopped trying as hard. The dinners at home became less frequent, her excuses for late nights and personal appointments more frequent. I almost admired her audacity. She didn't even seem to be hiding it anymore, as if she felt that I'd just accepted the distance between us as the new normal. In a way, she was right. I had accepted it, but only because I knew where I was headed and exactly what it would cost her. The real shift happened one evening when Anna came home, looking more worn out than usual. She barely spoke, tossing her coat aside as she made her way to the kitchen. I watched her quietly, noting how she seemed tense, like she was carrying a weight she couldn't shake off. For a brief moment, I wondered if she was feeling guilty, but the thought was fleeting. I'd learned better than to expect remorse. "Long day?" I asked, keeping my tone casual. She looked up, blinking as if she'd forgotten I was there. "Yeah, something like that," she said, her voice flat. She opened the fridge, grabbed a bottle of water, and then headed upstairs without another word. I stayed downstairs for a while thinking, planning. Everything was falling into place, but I needed to move carefully. The next step was to make sure my transition to the new firm didn't draw too much attention. The quieter I kept things, the easier it would be for me to take my clients and leave Wheeler blindsided. The following week, I arranged a casual lunch with one of my high-profile clients, a person I knew Wheeler had always wanted to bring in for a long-term contract. Over the years, I'd built a good relationship with this client, handling every aspect of their account personally. They trusted me, respected my work, and valued my insights. I knew that if I played this right, they'd come with me when I moved. As we sat down to lunch, I casually brought up the topic of growth and change. I spoke about new opportunities and the ways I wanted to expand my skills, letting the conversation naturally steer toward my thoughts on leaving the firm. "I haven't told anyone yet," I said, leaning in a bit, "but I'm considering a move. It's just time for something new, you know? Different challenges, a change of pace." They nodded thoughtfully, asking questions, showing interest. By the end of lunch, I was certain they'd follow me wherever I went. It was an unspoken agreement, but it was enough. I'd taken the first client from Wheeler without him even realizing it. When I returned to the office that afternoon, Wheeler was waiting by my desk. He gave me one of those smiles, the kind meant to put you at ease. But I'd long stopped feeling any warmth behind it. "Good lunch?" he asked, glancing at the time. I nodded, returning his smile with a calmness that came easily. "Very productive," I said, and it was true. The lunch had been more productive than he'd ever know. For the rest of the day, I worked quietly, keeping up appearances, but my mind was already miles ahead, thinking about the next steps, the clients I'd meet, the strategic moves I'd make before finally walking away. That night, Anna returned late again, offering no explanations. She looked drained, barely making eye contact as she passed me by. I didn't push, didn't ask questions. She was free to live or lie for as long as she wanted. Soon, it wouldn't matter. Soon, I'd be gone from this house, from this life that had become a hollow shadow of what it once was. I'd been holding on to every detail, every piece of this betrayal, using it as fuel. Every small slight, every time she laughed a little too freely with Wheeler at that gala, every quiet moment she'd slipped away, it was all adding up, feeding my resolve. As I sat there, going over my plans one last time, I realized that I no longer felt anger. Not in the way I'd felt it that night in the hallway, hearing her laughter mix with his. The rage had settled into something colder, sharper. It was a calm sense of purpose, an assurance that when the time came, I'd be ready to walk away, leaving them with nothing but the pieces of the life they'd tried to tear apart. I wasn't a fool. They'd taken my trust, and they'd turned it into a weapon. But in the end, I'd be the one to walk away with everything that mattered. They could have their affair, their secrets. I'd leave them to it. And when I was gone, they'd see the consequences of underestimating the one person they thought would never find out. By the time I reached the midpoint in my plans, I could already see subtle shifts happening around me. It was like watching dominoes fall in slow motion, each one inching toward the inevitable. I kept a low profile, still performing my job well enough to maintain appearances, but I also maintained contact with my new employer. Everything was lining up. At work, I'd quietly made my rounds, meeting with clients I'd built strong relationships with over the years. I kept the conversations casual, never outright mentioning my intentions to leave, but the way I framed each discussion planted a seed. When it came time for the official move, these clients would follow me without a second thought. And when they did, Wheeler would be blindsided. I'd perfected the art of acting natural in Wheeler's presence. Each time he gave me that overly confident smile, I returned it without hesitation. But in those moments, I saw him more clearly than ever before. He was the type of man who valued loyalty only when it served his interests. The type of man who believed he was untouchable. One morning, as I prepared to finalize a few more meetings with clients, I noticed Wheeler's secretary lingering near my office. She looked tense, almost nervous. Normally, she was efficient, always busy, but today, she seemed out of sorts. "Good morning," I greeted her, trying to seem casual. She hesitated, her expression conflicted. "Mark, could we talk for a moment?" I nodded, gesturing for her to come in and close the door. I wasn't sure what to expect, but I kept my expression open and patient. She took a seat across from me, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Listen," she began, glancing around as if to make sure no one was listening. "I don't know how to say this, but I think you should know that something's been going on with Mr. Wheeler. Lately, he's been distracted, more than usual." I watched her carefully, allowing her to continue. She shifted in her seat, clearly uncomfortable. "I've worked with him for a long time," she went on, "but he's been taking a lot of time out of the office, especially on Thursdays. He's been meeting with someone." She didn't say it outright, but her look said it all. It struck me that perhaps Wheeler wasn't as discreet as he thought. Even his own staff was beginning to notice the cracks in his professionalism. And if his behavior was noticeable to his secretary, then it was likely others had caught on as well. It was a small thing, but it gave me an idea. People were already paying attention to Wheeler's actions, and I could use that to my advantage. "Thank you," I said, giving her a reassuring smile. "I appreciate you telling me this. I know it can't be easy." She nodded, visibly relieved, and left my office. I spent the rest of the day formulating my next step. I'd need to capitalize on this development carefully, subtly enough that it wouldn't come back to me. I couldn't afford to appear suspicious, not until the moment I was ready to make my exit. That evening, Anna came home later than usual. She looked tired, more distant than ever, and barely offered a greeting before disappearing into the kitchen. I watched her, taking note of her movements, her lack of engagement. She was deep in thought, almost as though something was weighing on her. For a fleeting moment, I wondered if she sensed that things were shifting, if she felt some unspoken tension between us. But even if she did, I doubted she'd ever guess the depth of my plans. After she retreated upstairs, I sat alone, considering my next move. Wheeler's distracted behavior was an opening, a crack I could widen. He thought he was untouchable, but the people around him were starting to see through his mask. If I nudged things in the right direction, his reputation would start to crumble before he even realized what was happening. The next day, I arranged a quiet lunch with a former colleague who'd left our firm a few years back. He worked at a respected competitor now, and his network within our industry was impressive. He was the type who kept his ear to the ground, always aware of the latest developments and rumors. We met at a small cafe across town, away from prying eyes. As we talked, I mentioned my plans for a career shift, choosing my words carefully. "I'm keeping things low-key for now," I said, leaning back in my chair, "but I've been thinking about making a move. Just ready for something different." He raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. I'd heard Wheeler's firm was doing well. "They've landed some impressive clients lately." I gave a nonchalant shrug. "They have, but, to be honest, the environment's changed a lot. There are things going on behind the scenes, things that make it harder to see a future there." I let the words hang in the air, allowing him to draw his own conclusions. He knew the industry well enough to understand the implications, and he didn't press me for details. But I saw the glint in his eye, the faint smile that told me he'd be sharing this tidbit with a few others. It was all I needed. Over the next few days, I could sense the ripple effect taking shape. Whispers began to circulate within our industry, subtle but telling. I heard from a couple of colleagues that people were asking questions about Wheeler, about changes in the firm's stability. No one had any concrete information, but the curiosity was there, the hint of doubt creeping into people's minds. Wheeler, however, was oblivious. He carried on as though nothing was amiss, still taking his mysterious breaks on Thursdays, still confident in his position. I could see it coming, though, the moment he'd realized things were slipping, that his grip on the firm and his reputation was weakening. I waited patiently, knowing that when the time came, he'd be the last to know the extent of the damage. Meanwhile, Anna continued to drift further away. She stopped trying to engage, barely acknowledging my presence unless it was necessary. I could feel the distance between us growing every day, but at this point it didn't bother me. She was free to live her fantasy, free to think she'd somehow escaped without consequence. Soon enough, she'd see the truth. That week, my new employer called to finalize my transition. The deal was set, the paperwork ready, and my start date confirmed. Everything was falling into place. I had a few more client meetings scheduled, just enough to ensure a smooth handover when I finally made the announcement. By then, Wheeler wouldn't know what hit him. As I drove home that night, I felt a strange sense of calm. The anger I'd once felt had given way to something sharper, a quiet satisfaction in knowing that I was in control, that every move I made brought me closer to my goal. They thought they'd gotten away with it, thought they could build their lives on the foundation of my loyalty. But I was no fool, and I wasn't about to let their betrayal go unanswered. When I pulled into the driveway, I noticed Anna's car wasn't there. I'd stopped keeping track of her movements. It was pointless, a waste of energy. She came and went as she pleased, and I'd given up expecting any form of honesty from her. As far as I was concerned, she was just as complicit in this game as Wheeler was. I went inside, poured myself a drink, and sat in the quiet of our living room, thinking about the life I'd leave behind soon. It was a strange feeling, knowing I'd built this life only to see it fall apart. But I'd rebuild. I had no doubt about that. And when I did, it would be a life free from the shadows they'd cast. In a few short weeks, I'd be gone, taking everything of value with me, leaving Wheeler to pick up the pieces. The clients would follow, the whispers would grow, and soon enough, Wheeler's firm would become a sinking ship. As for Anna, she'd be left to watch it all unfold, a silent witness to the consequences of her own choices. I raised my glass, a toast to the future, to the life I'd build from the ashes of their betrayal. They had no idea what was coming. The day I submitted my resignation, I was calm. All my plans, all the careful moves I'd made over the last few weeks, led up to this moment. I'd written the letter the night before, each word chosen to leave no room for questions. I wanted it to seem professional and polished, the kind of resignation that would leave Wheeler with no clue what lay behind it. I walked into his office that morning, holding the envelope in one hand. He was on a call, but when he saw me standing there, he quickly ended it and looked up, eyebrows raised. "Mark," he said, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Good timing. We were just discussing the next steps for that Westfield project. What's on your mind?" I handed him the envelope, meeting his gaze squarely. "I won't be here for Westfield or any other projects, Wheeler. This is my resignation." I watched his face carefully, saw the surprise ripple across it. For a moment, he was speechless. Then he cleared his throat, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I see," he said slowly, his fingers tapping the edge of the envelope as if hesitating to open it. "I didn't realize you were looking for a change. Is there a reason you didn't come to me first?" "There's nothing wrong with my work here," I said, keeping my tone smooth. "I just received an offer I couldn't pass up. You've been a great mentor, Wheeler, and I appreciate everything. But it's time for something new." He nodded, feigning understanding, but I could see the flicker of frustration behind his gaze. He'd been blindsided, and it irked him. "And where, if you don't mind my asking, will you be going?" His question was casual, but I could hear the underlying curiosity. "I'd rather not say," I replied, matching his polite tone. "I'll be discreet, of course. I'll handle my accounts carefully and make sure my transition is smooth." Wheeler studied me for a moment, likely searching for a crack in my calm exterior, any sign of why I'd made this sudden move. But I kept my face neutral, giving nothing away. He couldn't know that his betrayal and Anna's deception had set this chain of events into motion. "All right, Mark," he said a bit stiffly, finally breaking his gaze to glance at the resignation letter. "I'll, review this, and we'll make arrangements for your accounts." He forced a small smile. "Let's make sure we leave things on a high note." I nodded, gave a polite professional farewell, and walked out of his office. As I left, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. It was the first time in weeks I felt that I had the upper hand. Wheeler thought he could have everything: his reputation, his career, and Anna. Soon enough, he'd realized just how much he'd lost. In the days that followed, I finalized my transition. I spent each meeting subtly assuring clients that I'd be continuing my work, though I left out where. They respected my professionalism, trusting that wherever I was headed, I'd deliver the same results they'd come to expect. Most of them hinted they'd follow me, leaving little doubt that Wheeler's firm was about to take a major hit. I could see the tension in Wheeler's posture every time he passed me in the hall. He tried to keep things cordial, but the frustration was there, lurking behind every smile, every polite nod. He was rattled, and it showed. Meanwhile, Anna's behavior at home grew more erratic. She'd stopped trying to engage me, barely making an effort to maintain the illusion of normalcy. I knew her routines well by now: her Thursdays, her hushed phone calls, the lingering smell of Wheeler's cologne on her clothes when she returned late. But I'd stopped keeping track. I was already living in the future, imagining the day I'd walk away from this mess, free to rebuild a life they thought they'd torn apart. By the time my last day at the firm arrived, I'd lined up every detail for a smooth transition to my new company. My future employer had been more than accommodating, setting up an office for me, allowing me to bring my clients over gradually to avoid suspicion. It was the kind of seamless exit that didn't just protect my reputation, it amplified it. On my last day, I kept a quiet, composed demeanor, saying polite goodbyes and keeping my words to a minimum. Wheeler gave a brief speech, mentioning my dedication and loyalty, words that felt hollow coming from him. I accepted his handshake, forced a smile, and left without looking back. As I walked out of the building, I felt a quiet satisfaction settle over me. The game was no longer mine to play. Wheeler would face the consequences of his choices without my hand guiding him. All I had to do was wait for the impact. The first signs came sooner than I expected. Only a week after my departure, I received a call from a client I'd recently transferred to my new company. He was concerned, uneasy. "Mark, I've been hearing rumors," he said cautiously, his voice laced with tension. "Is it true that Wheeler's firm is struggling?" I kept my response calm, professional. "I wouldn't know firsthand," I said, "but the transition has been smooth on my end. If you're having concerns, I can assure you we're well prepared to take on any additional services you might need." He thanked me, clearly relieved, and by the end of the call, he'd committed to transferring his full account over to me. I knew that behind the scenes, Wheeler was likely scrambling, trying to understand why longtime clients were suddenly so eager to jump ship. The same clients he'd thought would remain loyal to the firm no matter what. Over the next few weeks, the ripple effect continued. One by one, clients reached out, expressing doubts about Wheeler's leadership. Each conversation only strengthened my position, solidifying my new role. And with each call, Wheeler's firm lost another pillar of stability. With my professional life on a steady upward trajectory, I turned my attention to the personal fallout. Anna had sensed the shift, though she hadn't quite grasped its scope. I'd been distant, calm, and polite, keeping her at arm's length without any overt hostility. I could see it bothered her, the way I was no longer emotionally invested. One evening, I came home to find her waiting, her expression tense, as if she had finally gathered the courage to address the elephant in the room. She glanced at me, uncertainty in her eyes. "Mark, is something going on?" she asked carefully. I looked at her, a quiet resignation in my tone. "Nothing you'd care about," I said, not meeting her gaze. "But I think it's time we face facts, Anna. I'm moving on, and you should too." She paled, caught off guard. I'd never directly addressed her affair, never openly acknowledged what I knew. But now, standing in front of her, I could see her beginning to understand that I was finished, that the life we'd built was a thing of the past. As Wheeler's firm faltered, the cracks widened. He'd lost key clients, and whispers circulated through the industry. Soon, investors grew wary, and even his most loyal employees began to jump ship. His Thursday appointments continued, but his professional image was crumbling, his reputation tarnished beyond repair. Finally, I received word that Wheeler had been forced to step down, his firm's instability reaching a point where his leadership was no longer sustainable. He'd overestimated his influence, believing that his hold over clients and colleagues was unbreakable. But now, facing the reality of a sinking firm, he was left with nothing but the remnants of his mistakes. With Wheeler's career in ruins and Anna's betrayal exposed, I felt the satisfaction of a man who'd reclaimed control over his life. I moved on, finding new purpose in my work and new connections that filled the empty spaces Anna had left behind. I didn't need to confront her with accusations or linger in the past. I'd set my course and walked away, letting the pieces fall where they may. In the end, Wheeler and Anna were left with only the consequences of their choices, while I moved forward, carrying nothing but the lessons learned. The life I'd rebuilt was stronger, anchored by the realization that I'd been the architect of my own revenge, swift, silent, and ultimately final.